Understandest what thou readest? We're going to work to understand a little false friend in the King James Version today. It's in a phrase used in 2 Timothy to describe the character of an elder or a teacher in the church. He must be, quote, apt to teach. A false friend, remember, is 3 things. It's a word in the King James Version that we still use. It's a word we use differently than did the Elizabethans 400 plus years ago. And third, it's a word set in a place in the King James Version where modern readers are unlikely to notice that they are misunderstanding. We also have 4 steps for discerning these false friends and discovering what they mean, plus a possible bonus step for the truly dedicated. First, we notice a possible false friend either through a contextual conflict or, more likely, through checking multiple English translations. Second, we look up the underlying Hebrew or Greek word in a responsible Hebrew or Greek lexicon. Third, we look up the King James word in a contemporary dictionary to see what it can mean today. Fourth, and finally, we look up the English word in the Oxford English Dictionary to discover what it could mean in 1611. The possible bonus step is that we check linguistic corpuses, both corpuses that describe English as it is now and corpuses that describe it as it was in the past. Let's jump onto my iPad and go through these steps. The first step, again, in discovering a false friend is to notice a possibility. So, there are 2 ways to do this. One is through contextual conflict, and the other is through checking of other translations. I've got 2 translations up here. On the right, I've got the King James Version, and on the left, I have the English Standard Version. And through contextual conflict, I notice several possible false friends in this area of the King James. As I read along, I see that foolish and unlearned questions are supposed to be avoided by the servant of the Lord, knowing that they do gender strifes. Well, that's not the way I would say it. Maybe engender, or more likely cause strifes. And I could see somebody who is really new to the King James getting really tripped up by this because they would think it means that they do gender strifes, like fights between men and women, but that's probably not going to be very many King James readers. I think most people will successfully get past that minor false friend. And the next one too, if they're observing the context, they will. The servant of the Lord must not strive. Well, normally by itself, that would mean the servant of the Lord must not try hard. But since we just read the word strifes, most people hopefully will pick up that that's the kind of striving they're talking about, fighting with other people. Still, I wouldn't put it that way because it's easy to say fight instead of strive or be quarrelsome. That's the way the ESV puts it. The servant of the Lord must not be quarrelsome. But here's this third one, and this is the one we'll talk about now. Apt to teach. I always understood that my whole life without really thinking about it as meaning inclined to teach, likely to teach, like the guy who loves to tinker with cars is apt to be in his garage every single Saturday. But I noticed that other translations didn't put it that way. They said able to teach. And let's go over to the NIV, which is on the left. They said the same thing, able to teach. The New American Standard Bible on the right says the same thing, able to teach. And they give a cross-reference, 1 Timothy 3:2, which is another passage which says precisely the same thing. So back over to the King James Version. My next step in discovering a false friend is looking up the Hebrew or Greek word in a responsible original language lexicon. I have already gone to the trouble of doing that for you. It so happens, and you don't have to know Greek in order to understand this, that these 3 words, apt to teach or able to teach, are translating one Greek word, didaktikon, which means, according to Bauer, Donker, Art, and Gingrich, the most respected New Testament Greek lexicon, skillful in teaching. Now, that kind of makes some bells go off in my head because on the one hand, well, that's exactly what the modern translations say, able to teach. Well, that's the same as skillful. But apt, inclined, that's not what the passage is saying. And yet we have this word aptitude. He took an aptitude test. What does an aptitude test do? It discovers your skills. So there is some connection here. And my hypothesis at this point and my search for the meaning would be that apt used to mean able, and has kind of held on to that in the word aptitude, but has lost it in more common uses of just the word apt. But I can check that out by going to a contemporary dictionary. So let's try that. Merriam-Webster actually does provide as sense one, unusually fitted or qualified, ready. And though I do understand this example sentence, proved an apt tool in the hands of the conspirators, that does sound like contemporary English to me. This is not the sense that my English brain gives to me when I read apt to teach. It's this second sense, having a tendency, likely, or ordinarily disposed, inclined. He is apt to accept what is plausible as true. That's how I've always read it. In a way, I don't know why. If this sense is still available in contemporary English, why did this one always occur to me? Maybe indeed I'm the one who's wrong. That's why we need to go on to the fourth step, which is looking up the King James word in the Oxford English Dictionary. And I have a nice little link to the OED right on my iPad homepage. And I will log in. Don't look at my password. Let's go look at the word apt. If I type it in the box, apt, and go down to the adjective right here, I can see this first sense, which is rare, fitted materially, fitting. Actually, it was actually William Cooper, of all people, who was a friend of John Newton, translating Homer's Iliad, his brother's corslet apt to his own shape and size. Well, we're not talking about physical things, so in apt to teach, so we can safely skip that one. But the second sense, this looks right. Suited, fitted, adapted to or for a purpose, having the requisite qualifications. Fit. Oh, that is just perfect. That the servant of the Lord must be apt to teach, suited, fitted, adapted, having the requisite qualifications. But then it says that to be apt to or for something, a purpose, is obsolete. Aha! So maybe Merriam-Webster wasn't quite right. This is where my English gut goes. I go with the OED because they say that aptness of things is archaic and aptness of persons, which is what we're talking about. We're talking about the servant of the Lord, a person, meaning fit, prepared, and ready. It says that this is an archaic use. Now, I've said in my intro video to this series that modern dictionaries often do conserve older senses, and they don't always mark them. In this case, I think the OED has been more careful and more accurate, and therefore more helpful, because this is exactly my experience. I did not hear this meaning in that word. I just never did in all the years that I read that passage, until I looked it up in contemporary English translations and realized that I was probably missing something. And sure enough, that sense that I was hearing is in the OED, having a habitual tendency or predisposition to teach. And that sense has been around a long time. This is a usage from 1570. Aptus is also the sign of verbals in bilis and participles in dus. Oh, I don't know what that means. Apt to be taught, docilis. Okay? He has a habitual tendency or predisposition. That is true of can be true of things or true of persons. Again, this is the sense I always heard. Now, if I can match the original language sense that I found in Bauer, Donker, Arndt, and Gingrich, skillful in teaching, if I can match that with a sense in the OED, Oxford English Dictionary, and I can, here, suited, fitted, adapted, having the requisite qualifications, fit, prepared, yeah, same thing as skillful. If I can match those two, then I know that I have got a false friend, because the King James translators had this sense available to them that they used that the OED is saying is no longer available to us. It is at best archaic and at worst obsolete in this particular phrase, apt to or for a purpose, namely teaching. So if I go back to Logos Bible Software and open up my King James Version, I can read this now, understanding what the King James translators originally meant in 1611. Be gentle unto all men, apt to teach. Able to teach, skillful in teaching, prepared for teaching, fit for teaching, not likely to teach, inclined to teach. This is what they meant, able to teach, and it just so happens that's what the modern translations say. Now hopefully thou understandest what thou readest in the King James Version a little better.